Who are we? We are the Remote Leader Project, and thank you for joining us. We do teaching and training for virtual leadership skills in the format of online courses, either on demand or anything that can be embedded directly into your organization, or through group coaching, because it is so vital for leaders to be able to receive immediate feedback on how it is that they're performing. And that is why we're talking about feedback today. And my name is Allison St. John, and we have Christina Rao here. We are the co-founders of the Remote Leader Project, and come from the leadership space as well as learning and development, which means that the information that we are providing to you is packaged in a way that is meant to help you learn it and apply it so that it sticks. So what to expect from our session? We promised 30 minutes, and that is because we are going to deliver everything in a micro learning approach. And that means it's bite-sized content. And that's purposeful because, one, at the moment, our world is just overloaded with information, and you all have so much to be doing with leading your businesses and your teams. But secondly, that's how adults learn. We can only retain and absorb so much information, especially in the workspace when we're bouncing from a meeting to a meeting in the work. So we are going to make sure that we give you a specific area of feedback to focus on while giving you the opportunity to reflect and apply. And we'll have the chance to do a breakout session so that you can learn from one another and then share with each other some of your key takeaways. So let's get started with giving and receiving thoughtful feedback. And again, it's a big topic. A number of you probably already have feedback within your cultural organizations already. We're going to narrow in on a focus, and that starts by asking a question.
And that question is going to be, let's start with, what is the most challenging element of giving and receiving feedback for you? Is there a particular subject or a piece about if it's delivered a certain way? So it sounds like for some of you, feedback feels a bit like this, where it can feel frustrating, or it can make people sad or mad or just really stuck. And it's not the result that you're wanting to have when you're delivering feedback. And when we have those interactions where maybe somebody gets mad when they hear feedback from us, or they want to argue or make their point of why something was done the way it was, instead of taking it in and thinking about, yeah, maybe that's a possibility to grow there, we get kind of gun shy about giving feedback the next time around. And what we want you to start thinking about is that the more we can incorporate that in, the more it's going to feel like a comfortable two-way conversation, instead of this big once in a blue moon element where some of us have maybe gotten a little traumatized because feedback comes in the form of an annual review and feels really tied to what you're getting paid. Or it feels like somebody has once bottled up all their feedback or all their criticism, and they give it to you at the end of the year. It can also be that people aren't actually giving feedback. They're giving criticism in the guise of constructive feedback, and they're not the same thing. Another thing is, right now, we're all kind of holding back on certain things because we're starting to see in this crisis, people move into compassion fatigue. So we're going to see people who are more reactionary than they normally would be. And that might make us a little bit nervous about giving feedback conversations. And we get kind of caught up in that feeling awkward or cumbersome to be giving the feedback. But we're going to make it a little easier on what to focus on. And remember that as we go through this, feedback is also an opportunity for connecting and growth and moving forward together.
So when we asked, what is challenging about feedback, there were a number of different answers. And that's because there's a number of different elements of what is actually involved in feedback. And if I were to now ask you, what are the elements of feedback? Most of you are probably going to start to call out and say it has to be specific. It needs to be timely. These are two phrases that are often attached to the definition of feedback. And then the rest of you would probably say it should be targeted. It needs to be meaningful. It should be actionable. It needs to be constructive. It needs to be objective, because as we heard, it's challenging to make it objective because it's easy to make it subjective. So these are all elements of feedback that are true and that need to be thought about. Now in the remote space, these elements have shifted and evolved slightly. And as a remote leader, this is what we need to know and understand, that the specificity given within feedback now becomes really the critical component of feedback and where the time and effort needs to be spent. And timeliness in particular starts to shift into just other elements to consider. And why? Why is this shift occurring? Because in remote work, we're working asynchronously. If you're on a global team, whether that's a media team or a side team, you could be working on completely opposite time zones. You could be working in different areas of the country, or you simply could be working in a different daily flow than your peer who is in the same city but in a different home or somewhere located differently. We're stepping away from real time and moving into more asynchronous flow of information. So when feedback is given, and it should still be provided in a timely manner, you can't be giving feedback to someone weeks or months after a behavior occurred and expect for that to be effective. But we can't necessarily expect immediacy all of the time, and that we need to be able to trust the asynchronous manner with which we are communicating. So go, Christina, go ahead.
Yeah, just to give one example of what we mean by specific, think about it as I could say, you talk over people all the time in meetings. Or I could say, in that meeting a couple days ago, you spoke over Allison twice. And that's something that we want to work on reducing in our team meetings so everyone feels respected, right? The difference there is when we're giving kind of those you always, you never, you often, we're labeling it as if it's this ongoing intentional problem. And we want to be, and this ties the specificity to the objective piece a little bit, you want to give them specifics that are like you're a documentarian, right? That you're watching the situation happen, and here's a specific instance that it's not emotionally tied, it's not, it's not arguable. It is, you talked over them, right? It was witnessable. That action and that specifics of like, it happened twice, or those kinds of things, in order to be able to adjust to them, helps to have an impact and be narrowing that scope to this specific thing, helps in the remote space for it to not be so general that people are starting to fill in the blanks with all the negatives. Because we know when you can't see someone else or you're not having the same level of interactions, you have to be very specific about it so that it contains it to one space, so it doesn't kind of create the space for them to fill in other intentions in your words.
We say very often in the Remote Leader Project that communication gets lost in the distance gap. And that's what's occurring when you're working remotely, just as Christina was saying, is we don't want that gap to suddenly be filled in with misinformation that's there. So what this all leads to ultimately is that indeed the delivery of this communication becomes even more vital also in order to make sure that it's specific. The Center for Creative Leadership created or provided a definition of various components of feedback, and they state harsh feedback does not help people thrive and excel. Indeed, effective criticism needs to be delivered with respect and care. So that's something also to know within remote work, is that delivery needs to maintain respect and care. But the question is, how do we do that long distance, over a camera or potentially asynchronously? So here are some suggestions. When you can have a face-to-face conversation, that's indeed what we believe is going to be the best way for you to be able to exchange in a meaningful conversation. So use your video. It's so important to be able to then have the body language and the facial expressions from both you, so the person that you're giving the feedback to can see your face as well as hearing your tone, but that you can begin to read their body language as well. And then when you're in the process of giving feedback over a video camera in particular, we have to work a little extra hard on being able to watch and monitor that body language, which also means you need the time to simply allow some of that to exchange. So allow also for moments of quiet and silence and that is okay. It can feel uncomfortable, but that's needed for folks to be able to think, to reflect, to be able to ask questions. Or in the virtual space, we have a tendency to want to try to fill every millisecond possible with some sort of noise. And so, in which case, you may want to consider, or you would think that you would want to just keep talking in order to fill the space and to belabor the point. But that's important as a leader, that you are mindful of that, that in order to give them the space, welcome silence and welcome quiet. And ultimately, know that when you are engaging in a feedback conversation, give feedback in the way that that person learns the best. So here's a couple of things to consider here when we're talking about this. Is now also in remote workspace, we have a lot of different options with way we communicate. Hopefully, again, you can have the opportunity to speak to someone face to face, real time, to be able to engage. But we do have the tool of writing and a lot of technology that now can exist for us. And again, if we've got a global team or folks that are working on different schedules that may be here, you have writing as a form to deliver your feedback. So how do we give respect and care in that? You just need to be mindful. But so there could be anything from a shared document portal that you could be providing written feedback to. You could have a project management task system where you can provide feedback directly on a task that may be occurring. Those all of which may be appropriate. There are a lot of people have Microsoft Teams or Slack now that people are chatting with each other. You could be giving feedback within that space. Now, this actually happened with someone, that a manager that we were working with recently, who thought that he was recognizing his employees. So he was giving feedback to reinforce behavior that was getting a result that we wanted. And he was doing so in Slack and providing that recognition there. He had the opportunity to speak with that employee on a one-on-one and actually brought it up verbally as well. And the employee lit up in response. And in that conversation, realized that that Slack writing meant nothing to the employee, even though the manager thought that they were the ones doing the do and doing recognition and providing feedback in writing. It was meaningless to the employee until the words came out of his mouth in a face-to-face conversation. And all of this is to give you some consideration and to think about, really, what is it that's going to work best for you in your team? And so when we're talking about feedback in the remote space, is ultimately we need to make a team norm for how it's given and received. So things that you can do to be able to discuss this with your team is go through various topics. What warrants feedback, when, and what's an acceptable delivery vehicle for that type of feedback, and what would even be a feedback model that may already exist within your organization.
So here's one of our favorite models, and it can often fit within, if you have a corporate model that's about how you're supposed to deliver feedback, these can also work as really good questions to ask yourself before you go into it. Because like we talked about before, feedback's actually a great opportunity to remember to also focus on what should somebody do more of. That's a form of feedback. It can be, you explain that great. You broke it down into little bite-sized pieces, or you made steps really actionable in that meeting. And I really appreciate that. I'd actually appreciate it if you stepped up and did that even more often than less of. This is kind of that difficult place where it feels like you have to be objective and constructive about your feedback because something needs to change or be reduced. Maybe something's a little over the top. So saying, I'd actually appreciate if we scale it back on this area, because I think when it's done so frequently, it kind of loses its positive impact. Then keep the same. That's also a great way to give feedback of what's sustainable. That is a really great action that should stay right where it is. And so using those as the leader or the people manager, think about what are the things that you can also encourage to grow, reduce, and what needs to stay the same. Because what we see from that is that it's important to really make sure that we're able to plan to move forward together, and that you set up follow-up meetings afterwards. because you want to make sure that any of those pieces, you create the space to do immediate action so that they're able to do more of it. This can even be, I had one CEO I worked with where if he had feedback on somebody's presentation to a client or sales pitch, then he would offer them 20 minutes to retry the section that he had feedback on so that they could make the adjustment immediately, even if maybe they didn't have another client meeting in the immediate future. He would be the audience and he would kind of help them and encourage them. So this brings up, this needs to be done on all scales. It needs to be that we're creating these norms, that we're driving forward together, and that it's ongoing in two-way conversation so that it doesn't just end up being when we're finally really frustrated, we end up airing our annoyances. Instead, we want to create this as your team norm and an agreed upon norm for the team so that it can really be a cornerstone of your growth. Feedback should be part of it where you're inviting it into and people are, and it's going two ways and it's helping us grow along the way because growth becomes the norm. Because that growth mindset becomes really important to be focused on, great, what's the little improvement I can make here? And what's the next little improvement? And can I learn how to do this a little bit better? Because we're all in danger of getting stuck in the fixed mindset that kind of tells us, oh, I wasn't born talented in that way, or I have these major boundaries, and those are going to hold me back. Versus growth mindset really helps to foster more opportunities for a team, more autonomy for individuals on the team, and more drive to actually master different skills because it says I can get a little bit better and a little bit better, and I'm smart enough, and these people believe in me, and I'm going to put the work in to stay gritty and keep moving forward with it. It's kind of like there's a story of Olympians watching a new swimmer, or a younger Olympian swim and saying, gosh, it's like he's born with it. He was like a fish to water, even though they had all walked the same path of how hard it was to get to that Olympic level, and that they had all done all the crazy early mornings and long practices. But as human beings, we go right back to that fixed mindset if we aren't careful, and we get stuck in the, oh, they must be more talented than me. They must have come by it easier than I came by it. And so we want to focus on feedback. It goes all directions within our teams and organizations because that helps each of us stay in that mindset where we're reminded that we're all working on something. We are all working to be continually growing and perfecting and moving forward. And that's what's going to actually get us the greatest results as we are working as a full team. So now to give you a few minutes to practice this, Allison's going to go ahead and move you into breakouts in just a moment. And we want you to focus on these three questions in your breakout. What elements of feedback need to be explored with your team to create a norm for feedback? What is it that can really incorporate it well in your team? And how could you foster, or if you're already pretty good at growth mindset, what could you do to sustain that on your team? And where could you adjust the way that you're giving feedback to encourage more growth?
All right, and as they are coming in, requesting feedback. So we talked a lot about the concept of giving feedback, and that goes both ways. And for a leader to actually ask for it, to request it, helps to open up that conversation, as well as to create that again as a team norm, that the feedback can both go as a way to give and to receive it. So thank you for that. So just as a reminder, this has been one core component of virtual leadership, and our entire series has been covering our 5 most critical skills. So if you were, in case you missed it, last week we talked about the importance of trust, which is going to go hand in hand with feedback, as well as setting expectations and boundaries, and then leveraging tech to be able to create meaningful connections and relationships, and being focused on outcomes to be able to help guide really important work. So learning is always ongoing, and at the Remote Leader Project, we have our 3 top courses that are being utilized right now are there. So please be sure to check them out, and please stay connected here within the Remote Leader community. We have been in existence well beyond the coronavirus because we have been advocates for remote work for a long time, and know that there's just some nuances and differences that are required of us as leaders, and we are champions to be the ones to help teach you how to evolve your leadership into the virtual space. So find us, Allison St. John, Christina Rowe, and the Remote Leader Project on LinkedIn, and stay connected to the Remote Leader community. Thanks so much for joining today, and be well.